essay we're discussing today is the essay Collectivized Rights. So this is an essay that came out in 1963, and particularly for those of us interested in politics and political philosophy, it's one of the most interesting essays that Rand has written. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss the essay itself and some difficult questions that rise out of the essay. So in a way, I will be devil's advocate on the most obvious objections to things that Rand is saying. And with us, we have James Valliant, who is going to help us understand why she's saying these things and how they're compatible with her theory of rights and her morality. So you probably know James already if you've been around our content. James is the author of the two books you see beside him, Creating Christ and The Passion of Ayn Rand Critics. So he's the, let's say, in-house intellectual who is helping us understand objectivism better because we are students and we don't claim any form of expertise. So he's helping us on the Saturday peak of courses, but also with the essay. So James, great to be with you.
Great to be with you, and I'm sorry I missed last week. What a fascinating essay you discussed last week, and I'm really sorry I missed that discussion. Just glad to be here today.
Excellent, thank you. So let's begin with the essay. So Rand talks about rights as being this moral principle that defines social relationships. And she makes the analogy that in the same way as you need rights, something as a guiding booklet, how shall I go on with my life? This is, I think, the analogy Peikoff gives. It's like IKEA gives you a guidebook, although IKEA's guidebooks are not great. That's what morality does. It tells you how you should operate if you are to live a good life. Now, the equivalent on the social level is rights. And then she makes an interesting point that I want James to discuss. So she says that the equivalent of subjectivism in ethics, which says, I do whatever I want to do, it's collectivism in politics, because collectivism says, quote, anything society does is right because society chose to do it. And she says that this is not a moral principle, but it's a negation of moral principle. And actually, it reminded me a quote that I think it was a quote by Immanuel Kant, but by Googling, I couldn't find it, which said something like, something might not be true, but 80,000 friends can make it true, or something like that. So it was a social metaphysics. So, James, here, why is Rand saying this? Why does Rand say collectivism is subjectivism? What if the central committee in collectivism is people who know better, experts, philosopher kings, rational people? So why is collectivism equal subjectivism?
If there is no objective basis for ethics, if ethical subjectivism is true, then what you've done is you've rejected, in effect, objective ethics. Just as subjective ethics is a rejection of the entire concept of an objective approach to ethics, that your very nature and life and survival depend upon this concept of rights being understood properly. Totally alien to Ayn Rand. Going back, recall Ayn Rand's defense of what rights are. They are a social principle, not just a political principle. I have to respect your rights even if it's you and me on a desert island, for my own darn sake. Why? Why? Why do rights pertain uniquely to human beings, for example, and by their nature as opposed to other species? Well, animals have to treat each other by force. They have no means of persuasion. Human beings have the capacity for conceptual and creative thought. They have the capacity for choice, which, as Ayn Rand understands it, is our capacity for conceptual creative thought. And therefore, they're different than other animals. The functioning of their basic means of survival, their only means of really knowing, depends upon a certain social condition, and that's freedom. Only individuals can think. Only individuals have choice. Therefore, rights only can pertain to individual human beings because of their nature. Any other concept of rights is going to destroy it. Just as subjectivism is in effect a rejection of objective ethics as such, so collectivized rights is a rejection of rights as such. It is the utter destruction of rights in a sort of Orwellian newspeak, turning the concept upside down and depriving it of any actual meaning. because only individuals choose, only individuals think, only individuals act, and therefore only individuals can have rights. To say that some group has a right, or that it's right because of the group says so, whether it's democracy or some other vox populi, but to substitute vox populi for rights is to destroy the concept of rights, for they can only pertain to individuals.
Okay, so what about then to the claim that collectivism is subjectivism? So why subjectivism particularly? So for example, what if we have a collective deciding board with the most rational people? Let's say we in objectivism would say we have there Onkar Gate, we have Leonard Peikoff, and these are the people who take the decision, people we trust. So why would this still be subjectivism?
I don't care who the authority is. I'm not turning my judgment over to some authority, period, end of report. My life requires, I think my life depends on my choices and my decisions and my judgment. And what's right for me may not be right for you in many optional areas. Individual judgment and individual freedom is the essence of the thing. The right to disagree, the right to be different. When you understand what freedom actually is, the functioning of the rational mind is permitted. That's what freedom is, permitting the rational mind its function in human survival. Once you divorce yourself from that objective, there is no objective way to justify it. More than that, at the very root of what it says, it's like altruism. Just as altruism, as we've discussed many times already, is a substitution of the real questions of what are values and why do human beings need values with the beneficiary. Well, it's good if it's good for others. Collectivism says the same thing. It's legitimate if it has a democratic vote, regardless of your rights as an individual, Nikos, or my rights as an individual. The great genius, as Ayn Rand observes, for example, of the American system, the American Bill of Rights proudly begins with the big, bold words, Congress shall make no law, ... restricting freedom of religion, freedom of speech, establishing a state religion, ... In other words, these are outside the power of the majority. These rights are outside of any group's ability to affect or change at all. Those are objective rights. If it's a matter of vote, if it's a matter of simply taking a public opinion poll, like Peter Keating does to find out whether Howard Roark's building is any good, whether, as opposed to using his own judgment, then what you've done is you've conceded, in effect, subjectivism. And you've, just like altruism, you've substituted the beneficiary, in effect, for the actual validation, the foundational roots of the meaning of the very concept, rights. Individual rights, as Ayn Rand points out, is a redundancy. Any notion of collective rights, group rights, is a negation of that and is in fact a rationalization for the violation of rights.
Okay, so let's go then to perhaps the most famous quote from the essay, which says, "A group as such has no rights. A man can neither acquire new rights by joining a group nor lose the rights which he does possess." And later he says, "Any group that does not recognize this principle is not an association, but a gang or a mob." Okay, so if a group has no rights, then how about the idea that as an American citizen, you can vote, whereas if I come to America, I cannot vote? Doesn't the right then become part of you being part of this group, which is called Americans?
The right is still an individual one. And the qualifications for electors are something that the state legislatures have every right to determine. In other words, they can set qualifications for electors. The right to vote, the right to force others around is in effect what the right to vote is. And only a legitimate use of that force, a retaliatory or self-defensive use of that force, can be morally legitimate, however great the majority that votes for it.
Usually when we're going to discuss group rights, not only in the way that today people say women's rights or LGBT rights, but also in terms of historically, and we're going to come to that in a minute, that ethnic groups of people did their revolutions towards more freedom. So in a way, it made sense to say Ottomans in this territory have rights, although they were not really rights, they had privileges. Greeks or Christians do not have really rights here, so we rise up. But we're going to get to national liberation in a second. So here's
it really relates to last week's essay, Global Balkanization, doesn't it? And the whole concept of ethnicity. Ethnicity has sort of, in contemporary times, sort of replaced national rights that Ayn Rand was talking about here primarily. But it's the same basic idea, the collectivization of rights. Ayn Rand, you see, in the 60s and 70s, when Ayn Rand was writing this and doing most of her political writing, in fact, in the United States, one of the great debates going on, for example, during the Vietnam War, was why should America intervene in Vietnam? Doesn't Vietnam have a right to vote itself into a communist dictatorship if it wants to? That the right of self-determination of the Vietnamese people as Vietnamese is distinct, and they have a right to vote themselves into slavery. And if a minority in South Vietnam don't want that, well, that's just too bad. Their property is going to be seized. They're not going to have freedom of speech. There's going to be show trials. It's going to be a systematic violation of their rights. Well, who cares about the individual South Koreans who might get oppressed? Democrats literally, as in my childhood, Democrats were literally arguing that Vietnam had a right to vote itself into a communist dictatorship. Or take Cuba. Many people in the 60s and 70s, when I was a kid, when Ayn Rand was also writing, were saying, well, sure, Cuba has gone communist and allied with the Soviet Union. They have a right to do so. Well, people would point out, well, what about all the significant percentage of Cubans who fled the country? Well, they fled the country. They were the minority. Tough luck on them. The Cubans have a right to vote themselves, not vote themselves in that case, but to choose and maintain Fidel Castro as a totalitarian dictator. That was the argument that Democrats were making, that nations
Sorry, why do you go so many decades back? I grew up.
That's when Ayn Rand was writing.
In my 20s, with people saying the same thing about Cuba. Forget Cuba. Cuba at least is, this exotic place. Iraq, part of the opposition against the war in Iraq, which I still think, by the way, was the wrong choice to go to war there, because what are you doing there? But anyway, part of the opposition was, well, Saddam Hussein is the legitimate government there. Therefore, you are breaching Iraq's sovereignty. Now, I have some questions on that, because there are some legitimate questions. So, for example, what if this crusade is a will to power and you have nothing to do there? But we're going to get there. But before there, let me ask a question on the next paragraph, because it's important. She says, quote, the notion of, quote, collective rights, the notion that rights belongs to groups, not to individuals, means that, quote, rights belong to some men, but not to others. That some men have the right to dispose of others in any manner they please. And that the criterion of such privilege position consists of numerical superiority. Numerical superiority. So here she talks about majority rule.
Well, Hegel would have said, the voice of the dialectic process that emerges every now and then in history, or whatever you give it. But Ayn Rand is absolutely right. In the contemporary context, democracy is what substitutes for this pseudo-legitimacy, as if democracy gives anything legitimacy. And that's generally the argument these days.
So let's have the democracy discussion then.
Yeah.
Many objectivists claim that, well, okay, democracy is okay when you vote for a government that's going to do very few things, like foreign affairs and all that stuff. Whereas the anarchists are saying, look, this has never happened. This can probably never happen. So why not, instead of democracy, why not have contractual relationship with people who are under the same, authority? So you don't want to call it let's say even there is a monopoly of force, but why vote for anything, since vote is always you imposing your rights to someone else? So how is democracy, even within the, quote, minimal state that Rand advocates, how is democracy compatible with that?
Well, for Ayn Rand, democracy is largely a question of practicality. That is to say, if you have a society that has a general respect for free speech, a democracy is, in effect, a peaceful way of change short of a revolution or a putsch or a revolt, a coup, an overthrow of the government. So democracy provides a peaceful means of reform and change in a society that respects free speech. And so the value of democracy is so that we don't have to go to guns every time we have a political dispute. If it was a matter of monarchs or dictators or one gang, one group of commissars versus another group of commissars, it would be gang warfare. Democracy is a peaceful means of reform, change, progress without resorting to guns. Now, Ayn Rand is a bit generous too about what's a generally free society versus what's generally a slave pen, and she's willing to make a comparison in her own context. If you have societies that do deny due process with show trials, if you do have societies that have seize private property, have no due process, no freedom of speech, well, that's a slave pen. Such a government is itself war on its own people, a systematic violation of the individuals within their territory. Such a state, and I put that in quotes, air quotes, can have no legitimacy, no rights, no claim to any propriety or status, whatever. Whereas a country that has a basic respect for due process, a basic respect for individual rights, no show trials, there is some private property, there is freedom of speech. That kind of a society is morally different, in Ayn Rand's view, than another society. Progress is made, step by step and contextually. Hopefully 100, 200 years from now, and I'm being wildly optimistic, we can get even tougher in our standards about what a free society should be. But in her context, she clearly distinguished, say, Western democracies, Britain and the United States, Canada, from the Soviet Union, China, Nazi Germany, Cuba. And that was the big distinction in her mind. Or these savage places like most of the Islamic world, much of the Islamic world still is today.
And we're gonna talk about the four criteria, because I think it's a very interesting part of, are we still in a territory where we could say, well, we're mostly free societies, but this is gonna be in the second half, so we need to keep the fun stuff for the end. So what you just said, Rand says a bit later, what he says, the citizens of free nation may disagree about specific legal procedures or methods, but he says this is mostly for the law and the politics scholars. So this is the details. This is about ironing the details. But the big thing is that you vote for minuscule things and you don't vote for what we do today, basically, which voting is how you loot whatever is out there.
And at the margin, Ayn Rand did not leave us an entire detailed philosophy of law. There are all kinds of detailed specific issues. There are marginal issues which are hard to even understand. Ayn Rand is saying that those kind of issues, right, are still open for future judgment. It's not to say that it may be subject to democracy properly if it's a matter of individual right, but it's the matter of the ongoing, hopefully positive progress. America's reversed, but hopefully the ongoing return to positive progress towards individual liberty that the United States had been on.
Okay. So here we come to the issue of whether dictatorships have rights. And here I have some pushback to do. Again, my hat today is the hat of devil's advocate. So, but these rights, he says, cannot be claimed by dictatorships, by savage tribes, or by any form of absolutist tyranny. A nation that violates the rights of its own citizens cannot claim any rights whatsoever. However, the context in the 60s is that many of these new nations, I would say even Cuba, the idea is that this new regime has substituted a regime that was even worse. Now, it's questionable whether Batista was worse than Castro, very questionable, but we can think of...
Batista was bad. Batista had all kinds of bad things. Question is it even moral to replace something bad with something comparably as bad, even if we're going to say they're comparably bad? I think it was worse, much worse, for the average Cuban in terms of their freedom and prosperity. I've spoken to enough Cubans who were there before and after to know that. But let's assume the previous regime was awful. Is replacing an evil regime with another evil regime, is it legitimate?
Oh, yeah, but let's see it from the
Neither.
point
If
of
we
view.
say both are illegitimate, neither could claim legitimacy.
Okay, neither can claim legitimacy. Okay, that's kind of
That's
makes.
like the battle between Nazis and communists in Weimar Germany.
Well, that's what I was getting though, because okay, let's say you're a Soviet citizen in 1941. You've escaped the purges. Life is kind of back to normal. Probably there's going to be a next purge, but whatever. And here comes the hordes of the Waffen SS, which, oh, by the way, you happen to be a Jew, let's say, in that scenario. You know, these people are literally going to kill. So you have two bad regimes, but you say, at least my regime is not actually killing me, therefore I'm going to fight for that regime. Or would you say this is an emergency situation? It doesn't change anything about the principles.
It doesn't change a darn thing about the principles at all. And in fact, Ayn Rand was vigorously opposed to any alliance with the Soviet Union during World War II. She thought we could have used all those resources against the Nazis ourselves. She thought that the Nazis and communists could have wiped themselves out if they were allowed to fight without our help. So no, if one is sending their victims to Auschwitz and another is sending them to gulags and psychiatric hospitals, there's no choice. There's really nothing to choose from. Take the
Not
Shah,
even psychiatric.
the Shah of Iran versus the Ayatollahs. Two really awful regimes, clearly, right? Two dictatorial regimes. The Shah had absolutely no legitimacy as ruler of Iran, but neither do the Ayatollahs and mullahs. There are two sets of interchangeable thugs, as far as I'm concerned, with no claim to legitimacy.
Okay, makes sense. So, and that's coming back to the last week's discussion, global balkanization.
Yeah.
That's when Rand says then the right to self-determination of nations apply only to free societies. But here's the interesting catch. Or to societies seeking to establish freedom. Now, again, maybe the freedom you end up with is not perfect, but again, if it's considerably better than the previous regime, so let's think about it. Think about it.
The United States Revolution.
Sorry?
How about the U.S. Revolution? The United States of America was revolting against a government that was one of the very best in the world, wasn't it? Maybe the very best in terms of respecting individual rights and having due process. Great Britain. And still America said, no, compared to you all, we're doing something better. Now, did America still have slavery for the next 70, 80 years? You bet they did. A horrible contradiction, a flat and evil contradiction to the original ideas of America. Did the revolutionaries of 1776 establish something better than Great Britain? Yeah. The British slave trade in the empire continued well into the 1830s. So, and did we do we eliminate established religion and establish freedom of religion and eliminate titles of nobility and increase freedom of speech? Yes. America moved away from Britain in a positive, more free, more pro-individual rights direction from a country and an empire that was violating those rights, even though that empire was comparatively the best in the world, and even though America at the time still had slavery. So context, context, context. Indeed, it was the ideas that founded America, the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that Lincoln used 80 years later to turn the Civil War into a crusade against slavery.
Okay. And now let's go to, for me, what is the most difficult question here. So let's say we have a government that we recognize that hasn't got the right to sovereignty because it does not do its job of protecting people's rights. So, quote, any free nation has the right to invade Nazi Germany, and today has the right to invade Soviet Russia, Cuba, or any other slave pen. Now, my objection here would be this. If I'm a farmer in Vietnam, I'd rather take my chances under Ho Chi Minh and maybe fly away at some point, rather than being obliterated by a napalm when I didn't ask for this and when there was no actual danger for the United States. So that's my biggest problem with the Vietnam War. It was clearly not a self-defense war. And then the idea that said that since we are there, we have to win. Because if we don't win, then our opponents are going to be stronger. I have a trouble with that. And let me say something more here. Rand says a slave country has no national rights, but the individual rights of its citizens remain valid, even if unrecognized. And the conqueror has no right to violate them.
Unrecognized even by the victims, even if it's a unanimous vote.
So
there's a thought for you.
So my issue here is this one.
Yeah.
The Iraqi or the Viet Minh who died, let's say, from the napalm or from a bomb, and that person would not have perished under the dictators. Let's say quantitatively, like that much of the people died from the war, that person could have escaped. Isn't this a violation of that person's right? Again, because this was not a self-defense war, so you could not say, well, sorry, it was either you or me.
No, it's not a violation of their rights.
Why
Collateral
not?
damage is not, well, the thing is when you have your own country, there are very specific rules that apply to police. And what police, in my country, for example, police have very specific rules that hogtie them. They can't just walk into buildings without a warrant. They can't just use whatever force they want. They have to use certain procedures that are very, very respectful of any collateral damage ever happening. When it's your local cop, any innocent loss of life is, I think, on the government's responsibility. This is not true with foreign countries. Where a free country does not have control over the jurisdiction of another country, it has to go for the regime itself. And the regime, in order to stay in power, probably has a great number of people, if not the majority, sort of consenting to it, whether it's a democracy or not. This is unfortunate for the victims, the collateral damage in those countries, of the people in those countries. They have a positive obligation to either flee their country, which is a dictatorship, or to change that country for their own safety's sake. They have to realize that their dictatorship means that they are subject to valid self-defensive actions by other nations that don't have detailed control over their jurisdiction. The only way to change things, the only way to get rid of a Hitler would be to take him out by force. Now, we say, oh, isn't that unfortunate for the poor Germans who opposed Hitler? Yes, it is.
Wait, sorry. That's a different situation, though, because Germany was an active threat to other countries. Vietnam was not an active threat. So the person who got obliterated by the napalm probably didn't even know what communism was.
Well, I'm backing up to the issue of whether the communist Vietnamese had any right, period, end of report. And any defense of that regime, someone dies from it. No, if a country has, let's set aside on Vietnam the practical considerations. It was a perfectly altruistic war, as Ayn Rand understood, a war we should never have been involved in, a war made even more immoral by America's use of the draft, a war that did kill people totally unnecessarily. Okay. Leaving the is it in America's self-interest issue aside, because Ayn Rand does make that as the great proviso. Free countries have a right to overthrow a dictatorship, but they do not have the moral obligation. That is a question of factual context. Is it in America's self-interest? Is it in NATO's self-interest? Is it in really our long-term self-interest to do this? And that's a totally separate question in Ayn Rand's mind. There are related issues, but it's entirely different than the right of a dictatorship. Vietnam, let's say someone was, a freer country was attacking Vietnam. The innocent victims in Vietnam are innocent victims, but they're innocent victims of their own dictatorship, not the nation trying to overthrow them. If it were not for the aggression, internal aggression of the dictatorship, if it were not for the internal aggression of the dictatorship, there would have been no right to invade or napalm or do anything else. The napalm falling from the freer country is liberating, if in effect it's liberating the country, is the fault of the dictator, not the liberator. That's the moral distinction.
So you attack a country particularly to protect its people's rights because it was an altruistic war, and by doing this, you burn them alive. So that's what it doesn't fit to me. Again, if it was a defensive war, I would understand it. But because it was not a defensive war, I think the first moral duty is to pack up and go home.
I agree. Well, I agree that our first moral responsibility is to pack up and go home because it served no American interests. Full stop. Full stop. It was an immoral war, not because it, A, attacked a dictatorship, or B, even had collateral innocent damage because of an attack on a dictatorship. I still hold the North Vietnamese communists morally responsible for every one of America's casualties there. How do you like that? So while America had a moral right to be there, America was immoral being, now this is a separate moral consideration, was immoral being there because it didn't serve America's interests. That is actually the distinction I would draw, Nikos. If it's an altruistic war, it does not mean that the government was legitimate or didn't deserve overthrow. All it means is that America was acting foolishly in killing their own young people and innocent people in Vietnam in the process. It wasn't worth it. So the wasn't worth it moral argument, I'm fully on board with you. It was immoral to do this war. Those deaths were immoral, but only because America had no interest in doing this. Not because their own dictatorship didn't subject those innocent civilians. The dictatorship did not subject the citizens to the risk of harm that came. It is the communist dictators that killed those people by starting that dictatorship.
Okay. I think we're saying the same thing. I would use the term self-defense rather than in self-interest because it was not self-defense. Therefore, I would take it the other way around. You shouldn't be there if it's not self-defense. And since you're there, it's like almost a moral vacuum then. Although it's not a moral vacuum because, for example, wouldn't we agree that
America's immediate self-defense?
Sorry?
I don't go so far as saying one country's immediate self-defense needs to be implied. An aggressive dictatorship is a threat to all nations. And a question of when you snip an aggressive dictatorship in the bud, I think we learned some harsh lessons from Hitler. And, prime ministers going over there declaring peace in our time just before Poland gets invaded. No, an aggressive dictatorship is a threat to everyone. And even, I would even go so far as to say that if a country is an aggressive dictatorship that doesn't immediately threaten, say, the United States, that does not necessarily preclude us from selfishly taking it out. Our selfish interests are broader than say, the overthrow of America in the next 10 years.
So the fact that the country,
much more broadly, and I would say that we can America can pursue its national interest even more than simply by means of self-defense and using force against dictators in the process. So long as it is in our self-interest. I don't think it has to be literal self-defense. Your country's existence is their backs against the wall. No. A dictatorship has no legitimacy. Any free nation at any time has the moral right to invade it, period. Now, whether they should or not is a question of factual context. And the context is more than the country's own national self-defense. It's national interests.
But also it has a right, and again, this is not only me, this is in the essay, it has a right to protect, to make sure that later the rights of these people are protected. For example, you cannot you cannot oppose the dictatorship in Afghanistan, a relatively light dictatorship compared to the Taliban, and then say, oh, here the Taliban, tough luck. Or you cannot attack Iraq, and then you have the Islamic State and say, oops, I didn't know this, what I was doing, tough luck.
Well, that's it. That's exactly it, too. You can't invade Iraq, it wasn't just Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff, but it was geopolitical experts saying, if you attack Iraq and overthrow Hussein, you're going to leave a huge vacuum for Iran. You're just giving Iran a big boost. And, of course, those kind of considerations have to come into play, too. Absolutely. Okay. And are those moral considerations? You bet. It simply isn't a question of a question of the legitimacy of the dictatorship or its right not to be invaded.
Because
never can
here's where I'm getting with that. Here's where I'm going with that.
Right.
I could see a rationalist saying, well, we have the right to attack every dictatorship, even if they're not a direct threat, because they oppose the rights of its citizens. But at the same time, the safest way to pursue war is, I don't know, maybe with nukes. Therefore, to make sure that people's rights are protected, we're going to nuke every dictatorship. I could easily see a rationalist putting these things together and reaching that conclusion. Where is the rationalist wrong?
Yeah, well, it's a rationalist error for sure, right? Because the rationalist is ignoring all of the other morally relevant facts other than the moral illegitimacy of the dictatorship. There is a whole panoply, there's a whole menu of other morally relevant facts, as you've just outlined, that bear on this. And a rationalist needs to take those facts, those actual facts on the ground, into account. Right. Is it wise for us to overthrow Hussein right now without leaving Iran in power? Is it wise for us to stay in Afghanistan more than the time it took to push out al-Qaeda, which was, 19 years ago? No, it's not. And it's immoral because of what we're doing to our own soldiers, primarily.
But not
yes,
only, I would say, because
moral ramifications, yes, but necessarily. It's all connected. When you understand that ethics is a unity, you understand that the minute we start doing that to our own soldiers, we are hurting innocent people as well out there, inevitably too.
So why then not make the rule way more explicit, which says this is going to include a lot of blood, a loss of lives of innocents who have rights, even if for some of these people, these rights are not recognized. Therefore, in the same way as would say in law, you need to find the expert to say where's the yardstick. But here the yardstick has to be somewhere closer to there's a threat rather than, well, every unfree regime could be a threat.
Right. I would agree with that. There has to be an implicit threat to other nations, but any aggressive dictatorship is such an implicit threat to other nations, I would submit. But every time, no. In most cases, should America have avoided most of the wars it was involved in? World War I, the Spanish-American War, the Vietnam War, Iraq. Yes. We should never have been involved in those wars. Most of the wars that America has gotten involved in had served no interest of the United States, and actually, I think, made matters worse in the long run.
Out of curiosity, would you add the Second World War to that category?
Once America got attacked, all bets were off. Japan and its supporting allied Nazis were aggressive against the United States. We had no choice. Now, there's a whole controversy as did FDR know? Did FDR maneuver it? He'd wanted us to help Great Britain all along. So was this, to what degree? It's a controversy, and I don't take a stand on that controversy. But
Leonard Peikoff has taken a stance. Peikoff, in one of his podcasts, he's convinced that FDR knew.
Exactly.
However, the book that he cites,
I think that's what was Ayn Rand's opinion at the time.
But the book that he cites is, according to other historians, it's neither here. It's very questionable to put it like.
That FDR was angling to get us into war. There was little question. His private correspondence proves that conclusively. Now, to what extent he actually knew an attack was happening is a matter of controversy, and that's why I don't take a stand on it. But the question that FDR wanted us and was trying to maneuver us into a war, yes. No, Ayn Rand did not advocate war. She advocated trade. She advocated immigration. She advocated peace. To her, war is for example, in 1964, when she was interviewed by Playboy magazine, she predicted that the Soviet Empire then could be brought down without the loss of a single American life, simply by economic means and moral, and taking the moral high ground. That is precisely how Reagan did it. Some 20-some years later, Reagan and Thatcher took out the Soviet Union without the loss of any NATO lives. How? Through economic and moral means. And so I would have to say that it is quite unfortunate for the poor people of Cuba today that we have President Biden, who won't even give moral support to the people who are trying to overthrow the communist dictators today in Havana. I would say it's very unfortunate that the people of Hong Kong had Mr. Trump as the president. They didn't even get moral support when Hong Kong was being cracked down on. So, excuse me for getting a little hot under the collar, but I'm very distressed at American leadership because it doesn't even give moral support to those, or take the Iranians under Obama. The poor Iranians chose to revolt in Tehran and had the misfortune to do so under Obama, who was a friend, who was, I will use no profanity here. Obama was kissing the ass of Iran as their poor Iranian people were struggling to overthrow their government. So it's unfortunate when America gives no moral sanction to people like the Cubans or the Iranians who are trying to overthrow their government when it's happening, or the poor Hong Kongers who are trying to stay independent of China. Sometimes merely the moral support of America can make the difference.
Sometimes the problem, though, here, James, is not a problem actually.
But this this issue.
I couldn't agree more with all that. The only issue here is that by the United States, particularly through shady ways, supporting many thuggish regimes or sanctioning thuggish regimes, or if we take more of a leftist historiography, which I'll take with many pinch of salt, initiating these regimes, it's difficult to, not difficult, it's more difficult to persuade the average person that, yes, it is proper for the Cubans to go out with an American flag. Because when they do it now, they say, oh, another CIA operative like with Pinochet, or like with many dictatorships that were sanctioned, or many brutal regimes that were sanctioned by the United States in one way or another.
Yes, yes. Well, you pointed out the government in Cuba before. Castro was not a very nice government. Didn't respect the rights of their people systematically sometimes, or take
horrible torture
a relationship with the Shah of Iran. We sure set ourselves up for the Ayatollah there. I agree with Rand. We should never have allowed our oil facilities to have been nationalized. We should have done something about that. But you know what it was? It's like our relationship with China now. We've opened up diplomatic relations, cultural exchanges. We even subsidize trade with them. The government negotiates trade deals with them. We are supporting the dictatorship of China. We are sanctioning it. We are materially keeping it afloat with our trade and our increasing trade. Now, there were people who thought that increasing trade with China would liberalize them. That has turned out not to be the case. No, dealing with a dictatorship is always wrong. Government dealing with a dictatorship is always wrong. If we simply did not have diplomatic relations with China, most of our trade with China would not happen because most private companies wouldn't take the risk. It's if you sanctioned and subsidized by our government.
And if you dig a bit deeper in the whole discussion around the pandemic and the lab leak theory, I mean, even if the theory is not correct, but you see the scientific cooperation, which on the one hand you say, well, scientific cooperation is good, but then you say, do I really want to with this regime? Anyway.
What the hell? I'm sorry, I'm going to get emotional again. What the hell was America doing cooperating in virus research, which would gain function of the virus and make it more, spreadable? A lab we knew the Chinese military was working with. So here we are sending money to a lab that is run and funded by the Chinese government, that even has Chinese military intervention, developing a worse kind of virus? What the hell? Only government science. That's government science in operation for you.
Okay. Now, we promised people we would go to the $1 million question, which is, where are we today in Rand's definition of what a dictatorship is? So and also to navigate a bit where we are with the essay. So this discussion has mostly been on what are group rights, on whether there is such a thing, and most importantly, when does the government have the claim to say, I have sovereignty and legitimacy? And here Rand gives us 4 characteristics, which, as he says, would brand a country unmistakably as a dictatorship. So the rule of thumb is, if a country is one of these countries, then even a semi-free country, even a Keynesian mixed economy, for example, has a moral legitimacy to throw that government out. And here are the 4 things. 1, one-party rule. 2, execution without a trial or with a mock trial, like Moscow 37, 38.
Yeah, that comes to mind.
Nationalization or expropriation of private property. Well, an example here would be Cuba, even Venezuela, more recently, Iran, the one that you mentioned.
Even to some extent, Nazi Germany, even though many businesses retained private titles, lots of people lost their title to property. For example, most Jews.
All right. Yeah. So that counts as expropriation. Yeah, that's a good point.
No, one part rule, expropriation of property. Show trial.
And number 4, sorry?
And show trials, yeah. In fact, Nazi Germany show trials. I mean, some of the most powerful things that the Nuremberg trials after the war revealed were how Nazi judges subverted previous German law to get their eugenics, to get their anti-Semitism across. No, even Nazi Germany had show trials.
And the interesting thing is that to show how you don't wake up one morning and it's dictatorship and yesterday was democracy. And how it's, if you know the story about the arsoning of Reichstag, the fire in Reichstag, the guy who gets arrested is a Dutch communist. And there's a theory that he was a bit not mentally stable, and naturally he was the one. But at the same time, the Nazis put on trial Georgy Dimitrov, who was a very high ranking person in the Communist International, and some other prominent
Great example. Great example. And even communists and liberals were attacked for doing the things that the Nazis themselves did.
But that's what I'm saying. There's a good way that the Reichstag was not was actually arsoned by a crazy guy. But notice, within the Nazi dictatorship, in the first year, the court still operates relatively properly. So Dimitrov and the other communists are released, which would be unthinkable, for example, some years later. So you see how the erosion is not one day you wake up, oh, now I'm dictator. Right. The erosion can be slow.
I would say you don't need all 4 factors. I would say that one or two of those factors can be sufficient. If there is no free speech, that's that. In my mind, there can be no peaceful change. That has precluded the very possibility of peaceful change in the society. So a censorship, for example, makes a systematic censorship, a true no free speech, not Facebook filtering stuff, but real government censorship. When you've got real government censorship, there's no means of peaceful change. That in itself might be a grounds to say the government's illegitimate. Or the seizure of private property. If it's a mixed bag, it could be a mixed bag. But once you've started down that path, once you've started saying government can take any property it wants at any time for the greater good, then, of course, you've started down that path. And it doesn't happen overnight. Show trials, same thing. Due process does not, I'm a former lawyer, a due process does not die overnight in a society. No. Justice becomes slowly corrupted. And unfortunately, I'm watching that in my own country today.
Well, which brings me to the question then, where are we on this process? So, okay, one party rule is not going to happen. Democracy is too much of a sacred cow.
Well, I have to believe that the Democratic Party in my country is seeking one-party rule. Their election reforms are trying to, and their attacks on Republican election pushback are, I'm not one of these Trump nuts. Trump lost the election. Trump was wrong in saying he didn't win saying that it was corrupt. On the other hand, in the wake of all that, the Democratic Party has proposed a series of election reforms that, in effect, might result in one-party rule in America, which I have no doubt in my mind, would have no problem about.
But let's make it less controversial. So let's take the one party away. Okay. I would even say executions are not going to happen anytime soon. Now, justice changing very quickly. We've seen a bit of that lately. So we've seen, parts of COVID legislation were a bit
totalitarian.
Not totalitarian, even process-wise, how they came around.
Oh, they were in my country. They were systematic violations of existing constitutional rights. Boom. Your freedom of speech was gone. Your freedom of assembly was gone. Your freedom of religion was gone. You were basically put under house arrest. Fundamentally, your basic rights were stripped from you without any, there wasn't even a democratic process. The governors just simply asserted the right to shut down the economies and control people's lives. No, that was bad, but still, as bad as that was, maybe the worst policy decision in my lifetime from domestic politicians. I mean, it's going to kill more people than COVID. On the other hand, America is still comparatively free. America is still, still do not advocate the violent overthrow of my country by any means, because I believe that fundamentally we still have free speech. We still have mostly due process for the ordinary guy. We still have most of our property is private, at least nominally.
Okay, but wait. Here I want to push back a bit. The fact that you could overthrow a government with legal means, don't you still have the right to self-defense against the government?
Yeah, oh yeah. You do have a right. At any moment someone aggresses against you.
Okay,
Governments are criminal.
So why not then?
You have a right to defend yourself against the aggressor. Absolutely.
So why are you not then in favor of, let's say this overthrowing was, systematic, rational people coming together with principles saying, this is going to be the new constitution. We've made these changes. Please live peacefully. Oh, here are police officers with guns. Sorry, turns out we have to fight. Would you consider this a violent overthrow, and would you consider it illegitimate?
In this context, I would consider it illegitimate. Yeah. So long as we have, as I say, so long as we have some modicum of due process and some free speech, and we're not executing people for political crimes, right? I would say there's a peaceful means of change. And so long as there's a peaceful means of change and persuasion, we should try and take that until that becomes practically infeasible.
But the peaceful means of change means you have to persuade 50% plus one of the population. So why should your freedom be bound on 50% of the population?
Because I'm in a comparatively free society. That is to say, if my rights are even, take, for example, abortion or the draft. Those are serious fundamental violations of rights as far as I'm concerned. The moral equivalent almost of slavery. The draft and military draft and abortion, clearly they're forms of slavery, in effect. Real serious violations. America, the United States of America.
For people who don't know, you mean the banning of abortion and not abortion itself.
Forgive me, yes, exactly. The banning of making abortions illegal. And in my lifetime, the United States both had, at least for some period, a draft, and until the early 1970s, had illegal abortions nearly everywhere. So those were fundamental violations, but we had a means of correcting that, and we corrected both. And those examples show how, in a free society with free speech, there's a peaceful means of making good progress. More than that, the value of America to me right now, even with all its flaws, is far greater than any of my other options out there. I might make a couple of exceptions on a couple of grounds, but most of my other options out in the world are inferior to the United States, and qualitatively so. And so this is a value to me, a selfish value to me that I'm going to retain. By going out and trying to overthrow it, I'm saying deuce is wild and whoever has the biggest gang. And right now, I'm not sure that I would have the biggest gang. So for purely practical reasons, I don't want to overthrow the government.
Okay.
Because I don't think we have the biggest gang. And once you open it up to that, it's gang warfare. And the due process and the relative freedom that I have in America is such a value to me, even in its comparative form and vis-a-vis other nations, that is a value I need to protect.
Can I ask something? And again, please, people, this is not with my ARC UK hat. This is just asking a weird, very weird question. Do you think that objectivists would need a political theory quote of revolution, a political theory of regime change, a political theory of...
Ayn Rand...
where I'm going with that. For me, it's clear that, major spoiler for Atlas Shrugged. If you haven't been to part 3, now put mute and close your ears. For me, it's clear that John Galt is a political revolutionary. He's many other things, but he's also that. So, and what I notice is I find it very interesting when the climax of the book is basically something which I see as a political revolution, saying, okay, this regime needs to collapse. And actually, I'm actively going to make it collapse because it deserves to collapse. And here we are with a regime that a state that also, in my view, there's a good argument that it should collapse if something better is to come in its place. Isn't there a gap in terms of how do we make this happen? Because yes, you could say, yeah, we need to win the battle of ideas, but this is completely different for a political theory of political change.
I agree with you in specific. I think that we need to have a more detailed political theory of when a country should, and that is a broad question and more than just the legitimacy of a dictatorship, isn't it? As we've indicated, there can be many factual things that are of importance to that context. For example, do you have a good chance of winning it? Does it serve your interests? And that's a really broad question. So yes, Ayn Rand gave us a good outline and good principles, but I would say that there could be some further work and important work done in the exact moral proprieties of a nation overthrowing another nation. Now, as for Atlas Shrugged, I would point out that, like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, John Galt's revolution was a totally nonviolent one. He didn't do any, he just stopped, he and his people stopped. They just didn't. Ragnar is an exception, right? Sure, they go rescue Galt, but apart from that, and Ragnar, who we're even told in Atlas that some of the strikers don't agree with him.
Yeah.
So leave Ragnar aside. Galt's basic strike is a nonviolent one, just like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Now, Ayn Rand was not polluted with the idea that nonviolence is the correct way to do this, certainly not in every case. I think Gandhi and Martin Luther King worked only because the British press and the American press were on their sides. That kind of political action could only succeed in a liberal democracy, in my view. I think Hitler would have taken out Gandhi 2 seconds flat. So I disagree with it as a means of political change in many cases. On the other hand, I would point out that John Galt is a revolutionary of the mind, for sure, but his actual revolution was very much a nonviolent one, almost comparable to Gandhi and Martin Luther King, because he simply told his people to just stop.
Yeah, but again, Ragnar has the right to do the things he did. There's no question about that.
No question.
His friends are worried.
Ayn Rand is very, very clear and specific. It is the clear heroes and the victims of the new horrible state, people's state of America, that Ragnar is defending.
Well, not the people's state yet, not yet. So when Ragnar begins, we're not. He doesn't believe. He doesn't begin in We're 12.
This is true.
But anyway,
this is true.
We're out of time. Although this is a fascinating discussion.
But it is, and we could continue that. That's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, James. I always enjoy. You are one of the people who one can pull off discussions like that. Sorry, we have 2 super chats.
Oh.
So Robert says, Ayn Rand asked about the death of innocents in war. When Ayn Rand was asked about the death of innocents in war, she answered that it would be the neatest trick of the century if you could insulate citizens of a country from the results of the actions of the leaders. Yes, I'm not saying that Rand was like bloodthirsty or something. I'm just saying that when a war is not a defensive war, and particularly when you have no idea what you're going to do, why you're going there, and what you want to do there, but at the same time, part of your strategy is many people losing their lives that otherwise would not have lost their life, I think there's some question to be asked there. Another super chat we have from Apollo Zeus. What a cool name, Apollo Zeus. Not only Apollo.
I love that name.
So thank you very much, Apollo Zeus. Okay, so as we've said lately, there's a new feature, not a new feature, but we have a shop, a merchandise shop. And Raz is going to put the link on the super chat and visit it. It has some cool stuff, some interesting stuff, some fun stuff. Aesthetically nice stuff. Maybe some of them are more on the funny side, but there are many on the aesthetically pleasant side. So keep an eye on it. We have new designs coming very soon. And again, Ayn Rand Center UK members get a 10% discount. So James, thank you very much. And we'll see everyone next Wednesday for the context of another discussion. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day or evening. Bye-bye.